Myth number 6. the the accusation is made sometimes that if the U.S. doesn't get its act together in terms of fiscal austerity, then we're going to have the same kind of problems that Greece does and Ireland does. And it's understandable that people will worry about that because the Eurozone problems are in the paper every day, so it's a perfectly reasonable question to ask. It just doesn't apply. And the reason is the one that I mentioned before, that the U.S. has its own U.S. dollar system where the Treasury spends money to redeem bonds, to pay Social Security, to pay the military, all the things it does. That money goes into the economy. And there's no place else for that money to go except into newly issued Treasuries. It could sit in a bank if you wanted to, but then if it sits in a bank, it just goes into the Fed's excess reserve account, so it goes back to the government in a different fashion, which has actually happened to some extent. But basically, the market is pretty rational, and people who have the money look and say, well, I've got two choices. I can buy a newly issued Treasury bond, or I can leave the money in the bank. And they could buy a bond from each other or stocks from each other, but in the end of the day, when it gets close to the market closing, somebody's got the extra money. And if you put it in a bank, you get little or no interest, and the insurance is typically only up to $250,000, whereas if you put it into a Treasury bond, the interest is small, but it's fully guaranteed by the U.S. government, and the market, lo and behold, is rational. And so the money goes back into the Treasuries. It's continual, and some of the statements that are made are really, I think, irresponsible. People talk about the debt-to-GDP ratios and say, well, the United States is up to 65%, and if it gets up to 75%, it's going to be the end of the world. We're all going to fall off the edge of the flat world. And there's no basis for that. There's no logic to it. And if you look at Japan, for example, has a ratio over 200%, they keep selling Japanese government bonds without the slightest problem. As a matter of fact, anytime there's a flight to quality, everyone goes and they want to buy even more Japanese government bonds. So people make these assertions without the logic just because they think it makes sense, or because they're thinking of the Euro situation. The Eurozone countries are more like states in America. So the state of New York, the state of California, doesn't have its own central bank, doesn't have its own independent currency. It has to use the US dollar. And it has not only constitutional, but practical limitations on how much it can issue bonds into the market. And so the same thing applies to Spain, same thing applies to Greece. So, for example, if a Greek bond is maturing and the Greek government pays the money in euros to the holder of the bond, so now somebody in Athens has this $1,000 or whatever it is, that investor doesn't have to put the money back in Greece. It's euros, has to be kept in euros, but they could put it in euros in Germany, in Luxembourg or Belgium. I sort of lose track of all these guys, okay? Even France is now seeming more questionable, so maybe all the money will go to Germany. But they don't have to leave it in Greece. In the United States, when somebody gets paid in US dollars, it has to stay in the US financial system. There is no other alternative. Same thing in Japan. All the yen have to stay in Japan. Same thing in China. All the renminbi have to stay in China. Same thing in the UK. Because these countries have their own central banks, their own currency. They are financing in their own currency, not in a different currency. But the countries in the Eurozone have that fundamental problem that all of these things about bolstering up this fund and that fund are not going to address until they really think through what it means for a nation to borrow money when it's not its own unique currency.